Welcome to the Healthy Christian Leader. I'm Dwight Habermehl. Come join me in the living room for some honest conversations. I'll be talking to guests about their journey with Christ through the joys, the challenges, and the messiness of leadership. There's always something to learn from someone's story, so let's get started. Well, welcome, friends, to the Healthy Christian Leader. I'm here with my friend Seth Fancy. And Seth, you're a pastor here in Halifax.
Yes.
And you're pastoring specifically in Lower Sackville.
Yeah.
In King's Church.
That's it, yeah.
Which is a network of churches here in the Maritimes.
That's right, yeah.
Tell me, how long have you been pastoring there?
Well, 2017 is when we moved here to Halifax to launch King's Church Halifax. And I came on to King's Church around July 2016. And I was at our main location in Crispin-Amstutz, New Brunswick for about 8 or 9 months before we transitioned down here in April 2017. And then we launched King's Church Halifax 5 months later in October of 2017, and we've been here ever since. So.
Oh, that's great. We just arrived in time to go through the pandemic.
Yeah. No one told me that before we moved here. That would be the case, but by his by God's grace and God's mercy and resilience and all of that, we're still here.
So Seth, when did you enter ministry, finish your education, and enter into the pastorate?
Yeah, I graduated. I went to Kingswood University in Sussex, New Brunswick. Graduated 2006 and went right into full-time ministry right after graduation. However, I feel like in some sense, I have maybe a little bit of an edge on time frame. I grew up in a pastor's home. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, it feels like I've been in ministry ever since
your
the day
whole
I was
life.
born.
Yeah.
Correct, yeah. But I think for me, I would say my ministry trajectory as it relates to my own vocational call, really 2006 till present day. Yeah.
Well, that's very good to know, because as those who are pastors' kids out there, you really do get a different view of ministry.
Yeah.
You get an inside view, and
You do.
there were probably a few surprises when you got into the pastorate, but probably not a lot.
No. Some. I think. I mean, it's I'm so grateful for that experience of my life. Partly because I was adopted. I was adopted into a pastor's home, and so I've always felt that was sort of a grace that God has bestowed upon my life to grow up in a home like that, and. It's a special thing. It really is a special thing to be a pastor's kid, grow up in a ministry home. There's a lot of highs, there's a lot of lows, there's everything in between. So I think in some sense that was good preparation before stepping into vocational ministry myself.
Well, and that's a great lead into the conversation that we have today, because we're talking about understanding your God-given calling.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, as much as we share that as a buzzword in the Christian community, well, I'm called here,
Yes.
I'm called there, God's called me to this or that. I don't know. I think sometimes it requires a little clarification. It requires a bit of discussion, because, there's a calling that we have as believers.
Correct.
To sharing the love and grace of God with those around us, and to caring and loving others and loving God. Those are fundamentals for every believer. But then there's this calling into the ministry of equipping in the church that we find in Ephesians 4. And that's a unique calling. In fact, Paul talks about the fact that not all are called in some of these elements. So there's a uniqueness to that.
There is. Yeah.
So let's talk about that for a minute. What do you see as the difference between those two dynamics in calling?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're so correct by saying that, every Christian is called. There's what we would call a general call. That's the invitation of Jesus by his mercy and his grace, opening up a call to anybody and everybody who might want to follow him. But then you're right. There's that kind of unique call. There's the call upon my life to be a Christian. Mm-hmm. That's the general call. But then I think there's an even deeper, more personalized call where it's like there's a call to be Seth Fancy, mm-hmm. as the way God has wired him and designed him. I think there's a third level too, to be honest with you, Dwight. I think there's a call to what is God calling me to today? Mm-hmm. The responsibilities, the duties that I have today, Mm-hmm. I got 3 kids. I'm called to be their father today.
Yes.
This morning I had a men's group early at 6 a.m. I was called to be part of that group today. Mm-hmm. So I think this conversation around calling is very nuanced. It's very, I would say even robust and mysterious in some ways. Mm-hmm. But one thing we know from Scripture is that God calls people. Mm-hmm. He calls people. And calling is always first and foremost out of his love and his desire, I think, for us. As it relates to my unique calling, I would say, that journey, and I think journey is a good language for this. It's a process. Are there certain aha moments along the way? Of course there are, and I have those in my own life. But I think that it's like this kind of journey that God kind of leads us on and revealing to us what our unique calling is. Mm-hmm. And when we use the language of vocation, some people are called, like myself, to be vocational full-time ministers. Mm-hmm. Other people, I believe, are called into marketplace mm-hmm. ministries as well, doing marketplace things. The thing that's so fascinating to me is when you read the Scriptures, I love people like Nehemiah, because God called Nehemiah to a task, and that was to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem. But he wasn't a pastor. He wasn't mm-hmm. a priest. He was in government, And so I think I think vocation, like that unique vocational call, it's a process. It takes time. I think pastoral ministry is a special thing. It's a special call. There's actually a book, Gordon T. Smith wrote a book called Courage and Calling. He actually talks about pastoral ministry specifically. And he says this, I'm going to paraphrase this, but he says something along the lines that pastoral ministry is the vocation that helps bring out all the other vocations in other people's lives. This is very special. Other vocations maybe do not happen unless there's a pastor to help, equip, empower, preach the word of God, come alongside and shepherd and pastor people in the community. So I think it's a very special call, unique call. But I do believe there is a real time of discovery. And there's just, ways that God will reveal that to us as we kind of live into the story of our lives. So, yeah.
I liked what you were saying a little bit earlier when you said you included your kids as part of that calling.
Yes.
And one of the things that I totally agree, one of the things that I have done in my journey that's really been helpful for me is to look at my calling beyond my local church,
yes.
beyond the place I'm serving, and begin to see, okay, Lord, what am I called to?
Yeah.
And then uniquely, what roles have you given for me to live those,
yes.
That calling out in? I'm a father.
Yes.
I'm now a grandfather. And, I'm a business leader.
Yeah.
I'm an elder in our church, and each of these different roles give a place for expression and the living out of that calling. And I love that other word you used, Seth, there, which was stewarding.
Yes.
Because a steward it's a manager.
Yes.
And for someone else.
That's it. Yes.
Whom is the Father.
Yeah.
And I loved how you drew that out, because it's We often look at it as our call, but no, it's the Father's call
Yes.
to us.
Yes.
And we choose to respond.
Yes.
And that's so different than us finding our identity in that versus finding our identity in Him and our surrender to Him. I love it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I would say, early on, I think when this whole kind of journey for me began, I discovered when it comes around calling, I'm called to a who before I'm called to a what or a where.
Yeah, beautiful.
Right?
Yeah.
And so what's different for Christians than maybe for someone else is that my calling isn't based upon building a career as it is just responding to the voice of God.
Yes.
In relationship to Him.
Yeah, in fact, I've often said when challenged about decision making, I remember a specific conversation with my father years ago asking, do you think that's a good career move? And I paused and said, I don't have a career, I have a calling.
Yes.
Which is so different.
It's totally different. Totally, and and it seems to mirror like even how Jesus lived his life.
Yeah.
Jesus wasn't out there building resumes or trying to move to the next step in the rabbinical schools or anything of that nature. He told his disciples, he said, this is how I function with the way I live. I just simply do and say what the Father says.
Right.
For me to say and for me to do.
Yeah.
And so it's this sort of beautiful dynamic relationship with the Father that Jesus carries. And in the midst of all that, Jesus is living out his calling. And so I think there's a model there that Christ is trying to teach us something about what it means to be called first and foremost to a who, to God. And I think the where and the when will flesh themselves out. I think like when I went to school, like when I went to ministry school, I just kind of went for general ministry. I went for like pastoral ministry. And, I remember the first day of classes, they're like, do you want to be a youth pastor? Do you want to be a missionary? Do you want to be a church planter? And I was just like, well, I don't really have this sense to one specific thing or even specific place. And I do believe that God does call people to specific things. It's like, oh, I am supposed to do urban ministry in the heart of New York City or whatever. But for me, it was always just, I'm called to you, Jesus, and wherever you lead, I'll go, and whatever you say for me to say, I'll say. Whatever you call me to do, I'll do. I've been a youth pastor. I've been a pastor in a developing church. I've been an assistant pastor, and I've now planted a church. None of that was anything that I just learned in school. I acquired a lot of tools, which I believe is a big part of discovery of your calling. You got to know yourself. You got to know who you are, and you got to know. Not only do you need to know who you are, you need to know who you're not.
Yes, I agree.
You've got to understand, I think, and this is why I love John the Baptist. Like John the Baptist at the beginning of the Gospels, he's doing all these incredible things, and people come out to him. They're like, "Who are you? And are you Elijah? Are you Moses? Who are you, the Messiah?" And his response is really, I think, compelling, very powerful. He says, "I am the voice, so I do know who I am, but I'm not the Messiah. There's one coming after me whose sandals I can't even tie." So John the Baptist had a very healthy view of himself, of he knows who he is, and he knows who he's not. And I think that's really critical in this sort of journey of discovering God's unique, maybe calling for each of our lives. Is I got to know myself. I also need to be, I think, true to how God has designed me, wired me. If we are followers of Jesus Christ, we have been, He's given us the Holy Spirit. One of the things I find so fascinating is Paul's conversation into the church of Corinth around spiritual gifts. All of us have spiritual gifts. They're not all the same. We're all different. We're all unique. And I think all those things are really important, discovering kind of what that vocational call is. And I think another thing too that was big for me in my journey is understanding and discovering my call in the context of community. It took a lot of people over a period of years to identify things in my life that helped, I think, give some intel to me as to, okay, God, this is who you've created me to be. This is how you wired me to be. And so I think not sleeping on the fact that you need people around you who are willing to see those giftings, to see those strengths in you, to help you in that process of discovering how God has made you, wired you, where He's leading you, all those sorts of things. That was super invaluable. And I would say staying in your calling requires community too. You need people around you who will sing your song back to you.
Yeah.
And I cannot see a person doing this in complete isolation at all.
No, I think it's why Jesus sent the disciples out in pairs.
100%.
And, I loved Dr. Andrew McRae from Acadia, who's in the Lord's presence now. He said, Dwight, the most fundamental need of leaders is encouragement.
Oh, 100%.
And it's so true. Tell us about your personal experience in calling. How did God whisper to you, Seth, come over here?
Being a pastor's kid, one of the realities of being a pastor's kid, and this is just my own experience, but when you're going, and my dad, we went to a lot of different congregations as I was growing up, about 4 or 5 of them. But every place I went, I feel like it's the community or the church, it's their responsibility in some sense to be your uncles and aunts, and so growing up, almost every church I went to from when I was young till when I was in my, even till I was a senior in high school, I had people that would come along, and I don't know why they would come and tell me this, but they would say things like, you're going to be a pastor just like your dad someday, right? And certainly when you're young and your youthfulness, you kind of like, oh, that's really nice, that's good, As you get a little bit older and you understand you have some sense of agency and you're able to make some decisions for yourself, I really pushed back against that. And I think part of that was because I had a deep respect for my father's ministry and for his calling. But I didn't have any clarity as if it was something that God was going to call me into. My father, who I am so grateful for to this day, used to give me what I call the death talk when it comes to calling. I think you know where this is going. He would say things like, hey, Seth, if you are not called into ministry and you pursue that, it'll destroy you. But if God is calling you, there's nothing else you can do with your life. And so I think I had that with me, and there was probably a healthy sense of fear of I don't want to mess this up. I don't want to be where I'm not supposed to be. And so I actually went off to school. I went off to college to a Christian liberal arts school in Western New York, not to become a pastor. That was not in my frame of mind. General call to be a follower of Jesus, yes, of course. But at the time, I didn't have any clarity on sort of the unique calling that God might have on my life as it pertains to the mission in the world that we as a church are all to be a part of. And so it was a year of struggle, I think. It was a struggle of my identity, which I find is true for those in their 20s. You are leaving home to find home. Again, in a way.
I like that.
That's the struggles of the 20s to 30s. Now, where I'm at in my life now, that's shifted, that's changed. There's a different struggle in my life now.
Right.
But then I was really struggling. God, what is it that you want me to do with my life? I wanted to help people. I had all sorts of other ideas floating in my head of what that might look like. Maybe it's to be in counseling. I really love history, so I thought about, well, maybe I could do this through being a history teacher at a local high school. But it was at the end of that first year of college, I went on a trip to Honduras. And I actually went to go fulfill a Spanish credit. I wasn't going on a mission. It wasn't for mission work. It wasn't for anything like that. But being a Christian college, on this trip, we went to all these different churches along the way. And there was this one church we went to, high up on the hills of Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. We're in this church service. And I'm just sitting there. And I mean, this church is probably no bigger than this studio. It's a very small, very poor community. It's all in Spanish. I don't remember a single word that was said, except one word that came from a young boy who was about 5 years old. It was the pastor's kid at this church. And he gets up there and the pastor is talking about all his children. He said, but this one's a special one. And he said to his son, why don't you tell them what you want to do with your life? And he said, I want to be a pastor just like my dad. And those were the words I'd heard my whole life. And I don't know why those hit differently at that time, but it was almost, I can't describe it any other way than all of a sudden it was like my vision got very narrow, everything kind of got clouded out, time began to slow down. And I remember just kind of sitting there in this moment, kind of looking out the window, looking out across Tegucigalpa. And it was not audible, but maybe a whisper in my heart of God just really calling my name. And I knew that was different than anything else. And so it was from that, I come home, literally on the way home from the airport, my dad picks me up. We're driving back. And he says, how was your trip? And I said, Dad, I can't explain what took place in this moment that I had, but I feel like I'm supposed to go and pursue vocational ministry. That, I think, was the first moment that I enacted real faith and pursuing just that whisper. It was beyond just normal, I think. And so that's where I went. It was like I'm called to Him, and whatever this is, Lord, I'm called to You. I'm just going to trust You to fill in the details as we go. And so that's kind of my story. And that was 20-something years ago. And now I'm sitting here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. What an adventure, But it's just all been, I'm called to Him first, and everything else will sort of fall in place.
Very well expressed.
Yeah.
When discerning your calling, how do you differentiate God's direction from your own desires and ambition?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think when I kind of got to the end of myself on this whole thing, when I'm in a place of, I think for me, I was at a place of full on surrender. Like, I think God just began to kind of whisper in those moments to me. And I think there's just something you sense in your spirit about it. Like there's something deep inside of you. I used to have a mentor that used to say to me, Seth, when you're praying for something and you're wanting God to speak to you, pray at gut level. Ask God to speak to you in your gut, kind of in that deep recess of who you are. And I think there's just something very, very, again, I think it's mysterious in some way, but like something inside of you that you know, like this is God, and He's marking me in this moment. And then also, I think, again, going back to the whole idea of community, is listening to what God might be saying to the community about you, and receiving that, and just trusting God and taking those next steps. Yeah.
Such a great conversation. We've got about 2.5 minutes left.
Yeah.
But what advice would you share with someone who feels they haven't found their calling yet, or is worried that maybe they might miss it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, kind of going back to the flavor of this conversation, really around calling being a journey, a process. I would say a couple things. Number one, stay humble. Be humble. And second, be patient. Just be patient. God seems to work slow, I find. And God's timing is important. and God's ways are important. And so I would just say, like, just be patient, keep an open heart before God, be humble before God, and just continue to press in and to listen to Him. The Spirit of God is the one who reveals this to us ultimately. So really, His voice matters among all other voices out there. And so I would just continue to bring this before God. Just, God, what is it that you have in store for my life? Really, the pressure's off. It's really God. Again, a call is initiated from Him. And so, ask God to give you ears to hear and to listen to Him, to walk with Him. Ask Him, God, what do you want for my life? Pay attention to yourself. Pay attention to your experiences. I would say another thing, too, that's really important in all this. Nail down what breaks your heart. What is the thing that really stirs in your heart? What breaks your heart? And pay attention to those things. Take notes of those things. Find trusted elders around you to come alongside you and have conversations about these things. And I think in the midst of all that, God will just start to kind of lead you.
Seth, that's been so helpful and a great conversation around calling. And I know that there are leaders that will be listening to this that will be deeply encouraged. So thank you for taking the time and coming by today and having the conversation together. And we'll see you next time on The Healthy Christian Leader. Well, today's conversation was fantastic, but we're not finished yet. We'll be back in the next video with the same guest with more discussion about leader health. You know the drill. Subscribe and hit that bell. Would you join us for the next episode? You can find new episodes every week in video form on the Aaron Ministry YouTube page and in audio form as the Healthy Christian Leader Show wherever you get your podcasts. Aaron Ministries is an interdenominational network of friends in ministry with a mission to foster healthy Christian leaders. Check out our website, aaronministries.com, for more resources and information on how to donate or to start a healthy Christian leader gathering in your area. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.